Okay, if you have youngish children or grandchildren, you may know that Hakuna Matata is Swahili for no worries, a phrase made famous by Sir Elton John in Disney's The Lion King. Lakuna Matata, however, is pseudo-Latin and means no worries. Therefore, any supposed similarity between the two phrases is undoubtedly accidental. Editors of the Pauline corpus in Ge'ez, otherwise known as Classical Ethiopic, have noted numerous lacunae. The gaps are at times so plentiful that both damaged exemplar and inadequate translator have been proposed as root causes. Thus, Tedros Abraha writes of Ge'ez 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the overwhelming quantity of omissions, you can hear me a little bit better now. The overwhelming quantity of omissions will give a clue to the understanding of the group's Vorlage. It was either a seriously damaged one, or the omissions must be attributed to the translator's gravely limited knowledge of Greek. As of yet, no analysis of the larger data set of lacunae now available has been undertaken, and as a step toward this direction, this study investigates the significant gaps noted in the critical editions of Ge'ez Paul in order to determine the causes of textual loss. I'm going to continue with my pseudo-Latin. In my interpretation of that, that's preliminary caution. To date, studies of Ge'ez, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Hebrews have been published. There's also a dissertation on the pastoral epistles. Relevant data for this paper were collected by searching the introductions, text, and apparatus of these editions. Certainly some lacunae have been overlooked. Others, if particularly brief, have been dismissed. Even so, 39 minuses were identified from which tentative observations might be made about the state of the text in the earliest extant manuscripts and the period of translation itself. After their identification, the gaps required classification. However, determining the probable cause of a minus in an early version is beset with challenges. First, if the translator consulted a damaged Vorlage, how would one detect it from within the translation, especially one in which the earliest extant evidence dates 8 centuries after that translation? And this is a manuscript also from Sinai, also among the new finds. And the Glagolitic and the Ethiopic manuscripts among the new finds were identified basically within the same week. And this is the oldest copy of Paul's letters in Ge'ez we have. What I've circled in yellow is a reference to presumably a Greek monk who is Isaias Triados, which I'm going to mistranslate as 3rd Isaiah, which will come into play maybe later on. Naturally, by the way, this is missing the first part of the manuscript, the last part of the manuscript, certain fires within the manuscript, and even dislodged pages within the manuscript. So if somebody were trying to translate this as a Vorlage, imagine the challenges that would be presented by these huge gaps. Naturally, proof, let me see what's next. I'll go back a little bit. Naturally, proof of substantial loss would be unmistakable, for missing pages or quires could not be navigated successfully by a translator. Yet to what extent might substantive gaps present in the first Aksumite Bible still exist in the extant material evidence? Over the centuries, multiple corrections toward other sources may have obscured traces of such gaps. Nonetheless, the critical editions published so far lack any evidence for this type of deterioration. On the other hand, some minor losses of text due to a damaged Vorlage may still be perceptible in the A text, the earliest attested Ge'ez text. In such cases, nonsense readings might point to deficiencies in the Greek exemplar, but again, later correctors may have smoothed over inherited nonsense readings and even created a few of their own. As a result, discerning which nonsense readings belong to the period of translation and which belong to the era of transmission becomes virtually impossible, let alone determining if there was physical damage to the Greek codex. Other types of damage might be easier to recognize. An identifiable pattern of omissions could mirror harm inflicted on the exemplar by exposure to water, fire, or rodents. For damage from these quarters often affects multiple pages, and any resulting loss of text would appear at regular intervals. These phenomena are observable, for example, in the copying of 2nd Isaiah in 1Q Isaiah A, the Great Isaiah Scroll at Qumran. So, for those of you who don't know, Book of Isaiah in the Great Isaiah Scroll was copied from 2 different scrolls of Isaiah. So 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah. 2nd Isaiah has a completely different morphology, uses antithetic olive quite a bit. But there are places where the original scribe left gaps for text that presumably he knew was supposed to be there. Right? And then later, a person came in and filled in those gaps. But those gaps occur at regular intervals, which suggests that the Vorlage of 2nd Isaiah was actually damaged. We see this same type of pattern of damage in GA 1831, which I and a student presented on a few years ago here at the colloquium. Second, complications also accompany the identification and classification of visual errors. Scribal mistakes derivable only from the Greek text or only from the Ge'ez text are the easiest to spot, but when a minus could have arisen from either language, how should it be regarded within transmission history? Did that error already stand in the Vorlage? Did it occur in the process of translating the Vorlage? Or was it an error made by an Ethiopian scribe working from the Ge'ez translation, where it strictly imitated the word order of the Greek Vorlage? Because the Ethiopian translator followed Greek wording slavishly where possible, and if doing so did not impede comprehension, the genesis of some minuses is open to interpretation. Another factor must be considered in those many places where the translation was not rendered word for word, for any proposed minus based on parablepsis requires a reconstruction of the Aksumite Bible to determine probable cause for an error of sign. A feel for translation technique can be useful in this endeavor, but how good of a feeling can you get from witnesses 800 years after the translation? So every reconstruction must be considered tenuous. Unfortunately, the later Ethiopian textual traditions are of little to no value for this purpose, for perceived gaps in the text of a manuscript are corrected with translations from Arabic sources and in editio princeps with retroversion from the Latin Vulgate. Third, one must reckon with intentional omission. The translator might opt to omit redundant material, which is a translation technique found in other corpora. More frequently, though, it was the degree to which a translator had facility in the original language that impacted textual fidelity. One who lacked command of Greek might choose to leave out challenging passages rather than hazard a guess at their meaning. Thus, large portions of narrative disappear from the Ge'ez version of Acts 27, where the translator casts off the heavy burdens that threaten to sink the ship of meaningful prose, much like the sailors in that story. Keeping these challenges in mind, the minuses used for this study were analyzed with respect to the following categories: parablepsis in Ge'ez, parablepsis in or from Greek, lack of facility in Greek, avoidance of redundancy, damage to the Vorlage, and readings of uncertain origin. Lacunae easily explained as a result of parablepsis were isolated first, for it is unlikely that an exemplar's damage or a translator's decisions would correspond exactly with the parameters of this type of error. Although in many cases of parablepsis, the language of origin could be identified, those textual gaps derivable from both Greek and Ge'ez were classified with appropriate cautions as parablepsis in Ge'ez. Next, if it seemed reasonable that a minus resulted from Greek vocabulary or syntax that lie beyond the capacity of the translator, that reading was so categorized, since this is a widespread problem throughout Ge'ez Paul. The remaining minuses were examined as potentially due to translation technique or damaged Vorlage. Even at this stage, a number of minuses remained outside of or only loosely connected to the above listed categories. Although there is a danger of circular reasoning in this process, the degree of certainty about approximate cause determined the category to which a reading was assigned. To be transparent, when a minus might belong in a different classification, this ambiguity is noted. Finally, as can be inferred from the number of minuses of uncertain origin, lacunae were not artificially forced into a category. So, readings attributable to parablepsis in ges. Because the earliest witnesses currently date centuries after the original translation, probability suggests that the largest portion of accidental omissions originated from ges texts, and this does appear to be the case. There's a high probability that the following readings developed during that long span of time. Now, what I'm going to do for time is just give you one example from one of the larger letters and one example from one of the smaller letters in the Pauline corpus. So at 1 Corinthians 2:12, the equivalent for so that we might know the things that have been given to us by God was lost due to either homoarton or to homotoluton, right? And this is still based on a reconstructed reading that I have made. At Colossians 3, verses 15 through 16, there's no equivalent in ges for into which you are also called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, as you teach and admonish one another in all wisdom. The only plausible explanation for this substantial omission is parablepsis, where a scribe's eye jumped from malebikemu in your heart to the visually similar lebitsakemu yourselves. But again, based on a reconstruction of the A text. After what I presume is an error of sight, a copyist trying to correct the resulting nonsense resorted to the parallel in Ephesians 5:19 and changed Bamazmura with Psalms to Unbebu Basmura, recite the Psalms. This correction makes the lemata of both books nearly identical, where Ephesians reads, and recite psalms and hymns and odes of sanctification, praise and sing to the Lord in your heart. Colossians has, and recite psalms and hymns and odes of sanctification, praise the Lord in your heart. The origin of other minuses are less certain, but probability still suggests omission within the Ethiopic tradition, and I'm going to skip over those. In the following passages, a person working from the ges or the Greek Bible could have omitted the same text. These minuses are listed in this category because, as I mentioned before, an origin in ges, although technically uncertain, is historically probable. So at 1 Corinthians 3:2, the A text lacks, but even now you are still unable, which could have fallen out due to parablepsis in Greek and dunista, or ges. Philippians 2:4, the earliest witnesses lack most of the verse. Although parablepsis in ges is possible, a skip from skemu of yourselves to the skemu of others or your neighbors, one would expect the eye of the translator or later copyist to have skipped instead from skemu of yourselves to kolikemu. So we would expect the jump to fall down here. Because it has the same suffix. On the other hand, if a paragraphos occurred here in the Aksumite Bible, which is possible since the A text witnesses connect hekastoi to the beginning of verse 5, as in Codex Sinaiticus, rather than to the end of verse 4, then kolikemu, all of you, may have been set apart enough to limit the chances of its loss through parablepsis. On the other hand, none of the A text witnesses have a paragraphos at that particular spot. The lacuna is perhaps more easily explained as in or from Greek, heotone, skipping to hetero. About 13% of the total minuses surveyed in this study undoubtedly belong in this category of parablepsis in ges, and another 13% likely do. When lacunae that might derive also from Greek are factored in, up to 38% of the minuses could have arisen through parablepsis in ges. Now to look at readings attributable to parablepsis in or from ges. Some of the minuses probably date to the time of translation, for they are best explained as stemming from a Greek text. Certainly not all of these errors were found in the Vorlage, for the translator must have committed errors when moving back and forth between the Greek text and the ongoing translation of it. But in Romans 4:7, the phrase, and whose sins are covered, is not translated because of homoiotoluton. The missing line is found in the Ges Psalter 31:1. So its omission here is particularly surprising in the text manuscripts because we know intertextuality played a significant role in the ongoing transmission of the Ges Bible. At Ephesians 6:20, the version lacks "as it is necessary for me to speak." Presumably, homoiotoluton precipitated the error, but the parallel phrase "and more" is also lacking in Colossians 4:4. Perhaps the translator did not understand this phrase or considered it redundant. I still think it's parallel. So, omissions that I think are attributable to lack of facility in Greek. A number of translators were employed to convert early Christian texts into the vernacular. The particular characteristics of some of these individuals, like the one responsible for translating Revelation, can be distinguished. Common to all of them, however, is the struggle with unfamiliar vocabulary and advanced syntax. But whereas some attempted to render every passage, even if it required guessing at a scripture's meaning, like the translator of Job, many chose to omit problematic wording. The translator of the Pauline corpus belongs with this latter group. Accidental omissions cannot account for the following minuses, and I list a number of them. Rather, the Greek text proves too challenging to translate. Additional clues that point towards this particular problem include poor translations of adjacent material and pluses that could be regarded as abbreviated paraphrases of the missing text. So at 1 Corinthians 4:6, clearly the translator struggled with the context of this verse, as do we all. First, the name Apollos, Apollon, is taken as a participle, presumably of apolluo, so that Apollon dihumos becomes "I suffered because of you." Second, the troublesome text, tame huper hagegratai, hiname hes huper tuhenos, is abbreviated, and are you correct? Not a bad, certainly beats what's there in the Greek. This odd paraphrase might make more sense if a portion of the passage had also been dropped through parablepsis, either me to me or huper to huper. Either way, those are only explicable through Greek. But whether or not there was also parablepsis, we're clearly dealing with a translator who has no earthly idea of what to do with this. At Colossians 4:3-6, the last part of verse 3, dihodedamai, okay, on account of which I am bound, or diodedamai, because I am bound, through the end of verse 6, lacks a Ges parallel in the earliest witnesses. There are a few difficult constructions and concepts that may have motivated the translator to skip this section. I'm going to move on. Just to say there is a possibility, I don't buy it, but there is a possibility for parablepsis from the Greek here, but I think it's unable to understand the Greek Vorlage. There was no clear evidence of omissions due to the translation technique of omitting redundancies. There are a number of readings of uncertain origin, okay, but none of damaged Vorlage. I do want to look at one of 7 minuses that I've not been able to, in my opinion, adequately categorize. Hebrews 6:1. This is the one minus that has the strongest claim to be a product of a defective exemplar. In place of Diophentis, the version has uku, beware, therefore. At a minimum, this lemma renders somewhat inadequately Diophentis. But how does one explain the loss of the remaining text? Any solution must take into account that the translator did not see pherometha. For first-person plural verbs, would have been employed in the rest of the verse instead of the second person plural, beware, do not seek for yourselves, and you will repent. Therefore, accidental loss is almost impossible. Intentional omission due to difficult Greek is hardly plausible for the same reason. However, a defective manuscript could be at fault. Let me move to conclusions. There are two related conclusions that can be drawn from the study. First, the numerous lacunae in the Giz version of Paul's letters cannot be blamed on a seriously damaged Vorlage. Only 3 minuses may owe their origins to a defective Greek codex. No repetitive patterns of error were detected. Surprisingly, 8 minuses do occur between Colossians 3:15 and 4:12 that could imply localized damage. Even so, just one of the 8 does not clearly belong to another category. The high concentration of errors must be due to other factors. The primary force behind the lacunae is human error, which includes poor translation or no translation at all. I'm going to move to the consequences of these conclusions. These conclusions have consequences for future critical editions of Giz Paul and for the corresponding ECM volumes. First, editors of Giz Paul, of which I'm basically it, should not substitute later readings as readings in the critical edition. More importantly, in the ECM volumes of the Pauline corpus, extreme caution must be used when evaluating Giz support for minuses that appeared in the Greek tradition or found among multiple versional and or patristic witnesses laying possible new readings. Obviously, where minus in the earliest attested Giz text probably or certainly derives from a transcriptional error, the version should never be cited in the apparatus. Likewise, minuses ostensibly due to translator shortcomings must be excluded. Occasionally, though, it may be advisable to incorporate versional support when minuses in the Giz text clearly derive from an underlying Greek text. This may also hold true for those lacunae that might be based on a Greek text. However, in every instance, it should be noted that the agreement is potentially coincidental.
Yes. We have time. I think we have time for Samuel has a little bit of a shorter paper than is scheduled, so we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Okay. Tommy.
I was just curious about the timing of that when you have your methodology, you're consulting Tischendorf, Swanson, and so on. But as time moves on, we have full collations of 1 Corinthians. But you already done the work, or do you go back and
Going back, so one of the issues is that the editors did not offer exhaustive lists of minuses. As I was going through things, I found several more. So what needs to take place is a verse by verse collation between the Giz and the Greek, the full collations, right? So that's the ECM volumes are going to provide the opportunity for me to actually do the job.
Lucina.
Thank you very much. I fully enjoyed it in the Latin interpretation. I was wondering about this human error. Putting too much load on these translators and scribes. Perhaps they just had no text, so it was damaged, but then it just filled it in. And that's how we came to this weird wrong translation completely.
Well, yes, in terms of those minuses that I think are due to poor translation, one of the things that I noticed was that virtually in every case, it wasn't just that we're missing a large chunk of text, but the surrounding text is mistranslated. And there appears to be a plus of 1 or maybe 2 words that seems to intend to say, I know there was something there, I don't know how to translate it, here's my best guess, or here's the most I can get out.
But it's not like junctions like you have in Erasmus, so it's just,
Right. Yeah.
That's it.
Thank you.